All right, we are live. Hey everyone, thank you for joining A11yTalks July's edition. Each month we get together to learn and talk about a variety of topics related to online accessibility. Please don't forget to follow us on Twitter to know when these things are happening and when we release the recordings. We are A11yTalks, that is A11yTL. Sorry, TALKS. Wow. So to keep apprised of what's coming up and any other relevant information we're able to share. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Right now we're streaming live, but later on, want to come back, check something out, or see one of our past sessions, we'd love to have you. Please keep in mind, well, actually, for those of you who are in the session to be able to have the closed captioning, just keep in mind that you're going to be muted throughout, but you're welcome to ask questions. We ask that everybody who's going to enter questions, please go ahead and tag us on Twitter, in various Slack channels that we've all seen you in, or for those of you in the Zoom, just hit us up on the chat. We'd love to answer your question. A11yTalks seeks to provide a friendly, safe environment for all participants to engage in productive dialogue. So that we should be able to learn and share from each other in an atmosphere of mutual respect. So with that, we require all participants to adhere to the Drupal Code of Conduct. So with that, we are lucky enough to have Sarah with us today, software engineer at Microsoft, and we're going to discuss LiveRegions, how they work, how to troubleshoot error issues, and some overall best practices. Sarah, over to you.
Cool. Awesome, thank you, and thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thanks for coming to listen to this presentation. As Donna mentioned, there are actually live captions in the Zoom chat. So there's instructions on Twitter from A11yTalks on how to join. So please come in Zoom if you need captions, and there will be captions on the video afterwards as well. So yeah, today I'd like to talk to all of you about cats. So you see, I used to foster kittens kind of frequently. Normally I would get a group of 2 or 3 kittens. I promise this gets to web accessibility eventually. And 2 or 3 kittens is a really great thing to have in your home. They can really improve your day-to-day life, and they make your overall experience a lot richer. But sometimes I would get 5 or 6 kittens in a batch, and it turns out there is actually such a thing as too many kittens. Surprising. They end up taking over every moment of your waking life and often your sleeping life, and they can prevent you from doing literally anything else. And they generate a lot of poop, but that's not part of the metaphor. So on that note, let's talk about LiveRegions and notifications. So I made a kind of live example to demonstrate one reason why you might want to have notifications, or a use case for notifications, just to kick it off. This is a filter input on the page. It's actually a working filter input, so I can type into it. And every time I type a character, a list of notification-related technical terms gets filtered. So I can search for ARIA relevant, and I can see all the values that ARIA relevant takes, and that happens every character I type. So this works fantastic for me as somebody who can see, because every time I type, I see feedback happening on the screen. I can search for progress bar, I can search for alert, so on. And I see immediate feedback. If I make a typo, it's very obvious. But the thing is, if I were using a screen reader, this kind of immediate feedback wouldn't be happening. I wouldn't get the same experience. If I made a typo, and I were using a screen reader to know that, I would have to leave the input, stop editing, and go search for the results. If I didn't find any, I would have to guess that it was, because there weren't any there, and try to go back and figure out what was going on. And that's a much less seamless experience. So this is one good place where you might want a notification or something specifically for people who are relying on screen readers to just let them know about the fact that results are returned, and just like provide that visual analog. However, it turns out that you can, similar to kittens, have too many notifications. Because the easiest way to kind of provide this information to screen readers is to wrap the entire results list in a notification region. And this will end up being extremely verbose and also update very frequently, because remember, this updates every time I enter a character. So I've made this modified example to give a bit of a visual analog to what the screen reader experience would be if I updated with a notification, an alert region every time I typed. And as a warning, there's going to be things moving across the screen, so feel free to look away for a moment if you need to. So right now I'm going to type ARIA relevant, and you can see there are a lot of things, cats flying across the screen as I type. Even if I create a typo, it's hard to tell because cats are obscuring everything. It's extremely distracting. The cats are gone now. I'll stop typing, by the way. It's extremely distracting. There's a lot of cats. You can't pay attention to what you're doing anymore because you're so distracted. And at worst, you can't even tell what you're typing because cats are covering what you're typing. Similar to if you were using a screen reader, constant announcements would obscure feedback about what you're actually doing. So that's not good. Let's agree, that's not good. And on that note, I'd like to kind of now dive into a tour of the kind of types of live regions and information about live regions that you might find in the wild. So you can avoid that experience of creating a live region and making it awful. Because live regions and notifications are one of those things that can really enhance experience if you do them well, but if you do them poorly, they can end up being worse than nothing at all. And just as a bit of a side note, there's a number of illustrations of cats on these slides, kind of like the flying cats from before. Most of them are from Ed Gorey, who illustrated Old Possum's book of practical cats, and the colorful ones are from Andy Warhol. They're both prolific cat illustrators if you like that aesthetic like I do. That has nothing to do with notifications, just cats. I will be your guide through this tour of notifications. My name is Sarah Higley. I work as a developer at Microsoft where I herd cats. Usually I herd cats towards accessibility. And kind of as part of that job, I look at lots and lots and lots of products and lots of different products. And as a result of that, I see lots of different live regions, which is where I've kind of compiled this field guide from. I've explored out into the wilds, discovered all the cats there are to find, and I've brought them back for you and for me for future reference. So before going further, before diving into all the cats live regions that there are out there, I think it's important to emphasize two fundamental behaviors of all live regions. And I keep using this word live region. Usually when I say live region, I mean specifically the experience from a screen reader user, because this does primarily impact people who use screen readers more than other assistive tech. So normally when you're using a screen reader, you have control over what you're paying attention to, how you're navigating the page. Use keyboard commands or other forms of input to navigate through different parts of the page. You can hit H to go to headings, lots of different ways, but the user is in control of what the screen reader is reading and what it's paying attention to. Live regions take that control back and give it to the author. If you're a user, you don't have control over a live region. It's going to announce when the author thinks it should announce. You can't make it announce again, and you can't review it. Normally, if you're looking at text on the screen, if you want to, you can review it character by character and get more information that way. You can't do that with a live region. And you can't like go back to the live region and look at it again. If you miss something, you can't review it character by character. You don't have control over when it happens. It's very much an author-controlled experience and not a user-controlled experience. So that gives a lot more responsibility to people who make live regions, to authors implementing live regions. So with that said, let's go into some terms, some technical terms that you kind of need to know to talk about live regions and notifications, kind of like with cats, you talk about tabby cats, tomcats, tabbies, calicos. With LiveRegions, there are some terms that are very helpful to know along the way. So to start with, as I mentioned, I keep saying this word LiveRegion, and I also keep saying notification, and so far I've been saying both together. So to differentiate them, when I say notification, I mean any sort of notification, visual or not, anything that kind of like pops up that you want to let a user know about dynamically, about information that's happened on the page. It's dynamic, it's not static. When I say LiveRegion, I mean a specific type of notification that is programmatically surfaced for screen readers primarily. And I use the word LiveRegion because the primary attribute that you use to create it is ARIA-live. And there are two primary types of LiveRegions. It's a little more complicated, but basically there are two types. There are assertive LiveRegions, which, as the name suggests, are very much like saying, hey, pay attention to me now, listen up. And there are polite LiveRegions that are more like, hi, excuse me, oh, you're busy, you can finish that, but I'd like to tell you something. And you create these by using ARIA live equals assertive or polite. There are also, in addition to ARIA live, there are certain ARIA roles that you can use to create a LiveRegion. And if you don't know, ARIA stands for the Accessible Rich Internet Applications. I don't know why I said it stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. It's kind of a supplement to HTML. When there are things that are missing in HTML, you can use ARIA to create like more accessible experiences that aren't possible with native HTML. So part of this is ARIA roles that create LiveRegions. These are alert and status. These are the most common roles that can create LiveRegions. They have pretty good support across browsers and screen readers. They're pretty widely used when people create LiveRegions. And yeah, they're your standard issue LiveRegions. Alert is assertive, status is polite. But there are also some other LiveRegion roles that you may not have heard about before and that are less common. These are log, marquee, and timer. Progress bar is sort of in there. We'll talk about that later. And these have very specialized uses, and they have worse support, sometimes no support, and they're kind of in danger of extinction right now. They're in the endangered category. We'll talk about that a little more later as well, but they're in danger of being removed from the spec. And these roles, unlike ARIA Live, they do create the behavior of a LiveRegion for screen readers, but they also define semantics. So each of these have specific semantics for a screen reader. Alert has a meaning that whatever text is in there is an alert. Status means it's a status update. The others mean other things that we'll talk about a bit later. But these do have semantic meaning. ARIA Live does not, it just creates the behavior of a LiveRegion. In addition to these roles and to ARIA Live, there are other ARIA attributes that help you control the specific behaviors, the specific functionality of a LiveRegion. And these are ARIA Atomic, which lets you control what is going to be read, whether it's like when you update a LiveRegion, whether it should read all of the text within the LiveRegion or just the update. ARIA Relevant, which controls when a LiveRegion should read, specifically what types of changes to a LiveRegion should trigger a screen reader to read the text. That can be when you add something, when you remove something, a couple other things that you can look up later in the spec. But essentially, when you add, when you remove, both is controlled through ARIA Relevant. And ARIA Busy is a kind of more abstract one that indicates that an entire section of the page is undergoing changes and don't look over here quite yet, it's not ready. That's essentially what ARIA Busy says, and how screen readers and browsers use that is up to the screen reader and browser. The bad news is that these all sound great, but they have awful support, just truly terrible. It's not wonderful. We'll talk about like how that impacts you later as we go through examples of LiveRegions, but put a pin in that. And beware whenever you use any one of these. And finally, there is a native HTML LiveRegion actually, and it is the output element. The definition in the HTML spec is on the screen. It's that the output element represents the result of a calculation. So it does have semantic meaning. It maps to role equals status. And it works in all browsers, but Firefox and Android browsers, at least according to Scott O'Hara, whose research I shamelessly copied, and his article is linked in the slides and at the end of the slides as well. So with those terms out of the way, this is the part of the talk where I'm going to kind of go through different real world examples of where you might see LiveRegions around the web. And I'm going to classify them along certain lines, what type of LiveRegion they are, whether they're assertive or polite, what habitat you normally find them in, how rare they are, how common they are, and how risky they are. And for risk, I'm looking at how likely is it to fail? And also, how likely is it to create a really bad experience if used incorrectly? And also, how easy is it to use it incorrectly? So if something is easy to mess up and creates a really bad user experience, if you do mess it up, it's high risk. But if it's very easy to implement or has no bad side effects, then it's lower risk. So we're going to start, yes, this has an animated GIF. I will pause it in a sec if that's an issue. And this is your standard issue loading notification. And much like this cat, who I identify with strongly in these pandemic times, it's kind of just telling you that you're kind of in a holding pattern. You're waiting for something to happen. In terms of LiveRegion implementation, you want it to be polite. You don't want to yell at anyone that a page is loading. These habitat-wise, you find these all over the web, especially as single-page apps are more common now. Loading stuff asynchronously happens a lot. So there's a lot of, loading, like loading spinners, loading notifications all over the web. The risk is low, even if you don't, even if you create a LiveRegion and it fails, the user isn't missing any content because the content will be present after loading is finished. But it's still good to let the user know that something is happening, that loading is happening. So moving on, form errors are another very common type of notification that you'll probably come across, but these ones are a little more tetchy. They're more, these are the type of cats, like Siamese cats, where they, you have to work a little harder to make them happy. These LiveRegions are found exclusively within forms, but forms are so common that they're still found all over the web. The risk is actually medium here because inline errors, especially the sort of form errors that you see that show up as you're editing fields or as you move from field to field, are at high risk of conflicting with the user doing something else at the same time and either interrupting the user or not being read at all. And because getting errors on a form and not knowing about them and being unable to submit the form and not knowing why is a high risk of creating frustration. Like on this demo of a shipping form that I have on screen, there's a couple empty fields with inline notifications that have popped up saying the field is required. If I were to miss one of those, and if I were unable to submit the form because of that and didn't have any more feedback as to why, it would be very frustrating. So one way to get around this is to have very good information after submit about the error message, like allow submission, and then have a good error message and a success message when it succeeds with either a LiveRegion or a focus change, or to work very hard on your inline errors. But again, those are inline errors, and inline LiveRegions are at high risk of failing. ARIA-wise, for these, you probably want role equals alert. That's a good semantic fit for a form error. And for inline errors, you may want ARIA live equals polite to avoid interrupting someone if you also have very good error handling on submit, or you might want ARIA live equals assertive if it's a longer form, if it's more tedious to go back and find and fix errors, or if you don't have good error handling on submit. So it's very context dependent, as with most of these. Another LiveRegion that we've already talked about, you've gotten a sneak preview of this type of LiveRegion, is the filter or search the dynamic filter search live region, where you're typing something and results show up dynamically or are fetched dynamically, and you want to let people know that results are present. These are increasingly common. They can appear on any search or filter interface that, again, has immediate feedback. Not like Google or DuckDuckGo, where you search and hit enter and a new page loads, but the sort of like dynamic filtering and searching that you might have if you have like filtering on a data grid, or this example on the Hulu page, where if you search for movies, they show up as you type. For this, you almost certainly want a role equals status or a polite live region. You don't want to interrupt the user as they're typing. You kind of want to gently suggest that there are results. And for this one, you also want to make sure that it's not updating too frequently, because that's, as we talked about, is a bad thing. There are progress bars. These ones don't need much introduction. They've been around a while. They're similar to loading, except they have a defined start and end. There's a 0 to 100%. And they're often accompanied by an actual visual of a progress bar. And there is actually a role of progress bar and an HTML progress element that has good native support. And it's actually pretty good across browsers and screen readers. Usually like tones or like ticks, like sounds will tell a screen reader user what percentage it is. But screen readers can handle that on their own. You don't have to worry about it. You don't even have to think about it. It is fantastic. Now we're getting to some of the more rare and temperamental live regions. These are not just Siamese cats. These are the cats that, you have to put work into. They're going to be hiding in the closet for the first like month of being adopted. So the word toast kind of comes from the idea that these notifications are divorced from anything that the user is doing on the UI. They usually pop up in one part of the screen, often the bottom right, kind of like toasts pop up from a toaster, which is where the name comes from. And these are at a very high risk of going wrong in some way, and not just for screen reader users. They're at high risk for a number of different people. For example, if somebody is using a magnifier and they're like zoom text and they're focused on one part of the screen and the toast happens in another part of the screen, it's very possible that they won't notice that there was a notification at all and will just entirely miss it. Another problem is toast notifications, because they're divorced from the rest of the UI, they're very hard to navigate to if they have interactive elements or if you need to close them, because they might be in the tab order, but they're probably like at the bottom of the DOM. They're somewhere else from where the user is now. They're hard to get to and get back from. And on a cognitive level, they can be very distracting if you have too many, and they can be overwhelming and force somebody to kind of walk away from the UI in the worst cases. So yes. For screen readers, you probably want alert or status, depending on what type of content and what type of notification it is. It will entirely depend on what the toast notification is. Habitat-wise, you primarily find them in more application-style interfaces, not your standard issue website. And this is for good reason. They're more rare, higher risk, harder to get right. Now we're getting into even more rare live regions. These are feeds and chat messages. Usually they're very specialized live regions. They only occur in certain habitats, usually on their own. They're kind of loners. If you have a feed or a chat bot or chat region, it's usually the only thing in the UI or the primary thing in the UI. If it's not the primary thing in the UI, like you have a Twitter feed that's part of your page but not the focus of it, it probably shouldn't be a live region at all. It would just be distracting as a live region. So like this example Twitter chat, it's kind of on its own. To mark it up, you might want role equals log. Role equals log was actually made for feeds and chat regions. Role equals log on its own doesn't really work, so you have to add ARIA live equals assertive probably, even though log is by default polite because assertive will just work better. And if it's on its own in the UI, you want to make sure that a user knows when there's an update. And I've put ARIA atomic equals false here because if you wrap the entire chat region in a live region, what's at risk of happening is every time there's a new chat message, it will read the entire transcript for every update, and that is terrible. And the way you get around that theoretically is with ARIA atomic equals false, but that doesn't actually work. So how you actually get around that is creating a separate live region only for screen readers that's visually hidden and tightly controlling the text that you add there instead of wrapping the visual UI in a live region. I've actually worked on this with teams and that works quite well. And trying to wrap the entire chat window, the visual UI in a live region invariably goes poorly. So these are high risk as well. Even more rare type of live region that I'm going to go through quickly because you probably are less likely to work with these or to encounter these is the live chart and data live region or notification. And these are like stock tickers or CPU usage graphs, things that have like real-time updates and are just constantly updating as they're on the screen. Similar to like the search and filter one that we talked about, things that constantly update are at high risk with live regions because too many updates is just super overwhelming. So you have to manually kind of batch and announce updates if they're important to be announced. Like if you need a live region, if the user needs to hear updates, then you need to manually handle how frequently you deliver those updates. And at best, you could have some sort of like control given to the user, like at how frequent an interval they want updates to occur. This could also help with cognitive accessibility if you only add visual updates at certain intervals to also avoid overwhelming people visually as well, or avoid having constant motion. And there is a live region role for this. This is marquee. It's specifically designed for constant updates, and it's specifically designed to give control over consuming those updates to screen reader users. In practice, no support, doesn't work. You have to do it yourself. Timers as well, these are another very specialized one. They only happen in certain scenarios where there's a real world time limit imposed. Like say you're a stock trader and you've initiated a trade and there's a real world time limit that you need to complete it in. You never want to impose artificial timers because those have a whole host of accessibility issues aside from live regions, but sometimes you need to, and when you do, it's the same issue. You don't want to announce updates too frequently because that'll keep people from interacting and like completing the thing in time. So you need to manually batch and decide how frequent you deliver updates. You need to do that yourself because again, there's a role that exists of timer, but it has no support. Okay, so we've gotten through your domestic notifications. All of those are ones that you might want to welcome into your home. You can bring them into your website or web app and make a home for them and make them happy. Now let's talk about some of the notifications and live regions that you don't want to welcome into your home. These are the feral ones. They don't like human interaction. They're not comfortable with human interaction, and they might attack on site. One of these is control hints. This is a type of live region that developers sometimes create when they're already going a bit off the rails. They're using non-standard controls or patterns that have poor support in practice and trying to make up for this with a live region. Unfortunately, in practice, this means you're taking a fragile control, a thing that's already fragile, and adding live regions on top. So you have like layers of fragile UI, which is not great. It's at high risk of failure, and it'll probably fail spectacularly because you're also creating conflicts between the live region and user interaction. In this case, how you avoid this type of live region is redesign your UI, maybe make it a little simpler. If you can't do that, try to break it down into more supported patterns. Like if you have a combo box with a tree grid, like the unholy combination of combo box and tree and grid, maybe instead of doing that, maybe make a dialogue with a static input and some results that are statically navigable. But yes, simplify your UI. If you absolutely cannot do that, then try to write good static instructions, like have a help page that tells people how to use it, and prefer that over live regions because people can have control over consuming a help page and LiveRegions are very prone to failure. Another type of LiveRegin, this one's a little more common and a little easier to deal with. This is the combination focus change in LiveRegin, where you have something like a single page app navigation. You navigate to a new page, focus moves to the new page, and you also have a LiveRegin firing. Or you open a dialog and, excuse me, you set focus to the dialog and you also fire a LiveRegin. The solution is very simple. Drop the LiveRegin. Make sure your focus goes somewhere that gives the user context about where they now are, and that means you won't need a LiveRegin at all. You really kind of want to avoid cases where you have a LiveRegin and focus change happening at the same time, because those conflict and one of them is going to win and one is going to lose. Another misuse of LiveRegins is using them to communicate state changes instead of using ARIA state attributes. This one too is easy to fix. Just use ARIA state attributes. Things like ARIA expanded if you have an accordion, ARIA pressed if you have a toggle button. Don't use a LiveRegin to say that you turned a button on. Use ARIA pressed instead. And then finally, this is the most dangerous of the feral notifications. I call it the quick wrap. It's this hybrid monster of a visual UI change and a LiveRegin. Much like the cats in the movie Cats, they are kind of horrifying to regard. If you encounter them in real life, you probably want to run. These are very overwhelming. As I mentioned before, with like the chat UI and the filter input I demonstrated, if you just wrap an actual UI that's changing in a LiveRegin, it will be way too verbose. There will be too much text announced. If I were to wrap that menu that changed, or say you have a data grid that has updates happening, if you wrap it in a LiveRegin, the entire text of the data grid is going to announce every time it changes. And that's just too much. It's too much. You want LiveRegins to be concise. So avoid this at all costs, run away. This is one of the cases where you want a separate experience for someone using a screen reader, because wrapping visual UI in a LiveRegin is not an equivalent experience, because visually you can often ignore changes in places and focus on what you want to focus on. I know that's not true for everyone, but it's much easier visually to do that versus using a screen reader. You can't ignore it if your screen reader starts narrating the entire data table to you. You can't get anything useful out of it. It's not an equivalent experience. You have to do the work to make this work for screen readers and announce useful text, specifically useful text for screen readers and screen reader users. So now that we've kind of gone over your options for bringing home a new LiveRegin, maybe you've decided to adopt one now. They seem kind of more approachable. You've made your choice. You're bringing it home. And you might have some like transition issues as you try to make it comfortable in your new home. So now we're going to go over some tips for how to get along with your new notification or LiveRegin. One is keep LiveRegins concise. I know I keep saying it, but it's so important. No one likes an overly chatty UI. The more like verbose your LiveRegin text is, the harder it is to get meaning out of it, because remember, it can't be reviewed. It's not under the control of the user. Once it's read, a user can't go back and make it read again. So it has to be understood the first time, because it can't be reviewed. It's not under their control. So really just like keep it short as possible without losing meaning. And remember that LiveRegins also distract and interrupt the user's experience. So you want to keep that to like as non-disruptive as possible. So let's return to this example. Make sure I'm typing in the right input. This example of the filter input. And this time I've made some adjustments so that instead of firing every time I type, it only fires after I finish typing, after a small delay. So if I keep typing, nothing will happen. After I stop, it will fire a LiveRegin. There will be a cat going across the screen this time, but not as many. So if I do the same thing, I type ARIA relevant, and then I stop typing, for some reason the animation didn't work, but you saw that cat kind of appear and disappear, and there was only one, and it only announced information about the number of results returned. It didn't try to read the text of all the results. And that is enough. That's kind of what you want for a UI like this. So yes, we have fixed it. Another way another kind of way you can mess up LiveRegions is to rely on special characters. So depending on the text-to-speech engine of the user's computer, often special characters won't be read by default. And remember, because you can't review character by character, you can't go back and try to figure out what's missing. So if you have text where the meaning relies on special characters, it's probably not going to do well in a LiveRegion. Another thing aside from special characters is if you have non-text content like form fields or images, combo boxes, things like that in your LiveRegion, it's like the support is worse for announcing those. It's not terrible, but it's not as good as straight up plain text. And also remember, all semantics of text in a LiveRegion disappear when it's read. So if you have headings in there or lists in there, it will read as one long text string and you lose all of those semantics. So remember, LiveRegions don't handle rich text and they don't do well with non-text content. This is a slightly less intuitive recommendation, which is to set a timeout to remove notification text after you've inserted it into a LiveRegion. And this is only for screen reader specific notifications that don't appear visually. So if you're creating custom screen reader notifications, one trick you can do is add the LiveRegion text and then remove it after a short timeout, like half a second. Once a screen reader picks up on a notification, they're going to read it in full, even if you remove it. And by removing it, you make sure that you won't end up with duplicate announcements. You won't accidentally announce stale text that's still in the LiveRegion. Like say you have a LiveRegion and you push multiple updates to it. To make sure that only the relevant update is read, you can remove all of them after a timeout. So there's only ever one present in the LiveRegion. So avoid duplicate announcements, avoid repetition, set a timeout to remove your custom LiveRegion text if it's for screen readers only and not visually present. Another trick to make LiveRegions work a little better with screen readers is to be very careful about when you are inserting a LiveRegion into the page versus when you are updating an existing LiveRegion. So for example, inserting LiveRegions into the page is kind of like this. When I want an alert announced, I actually add the LiveRegion into the page at that time. This works well for role equals alert and does not work well for literally anything else. For anything else, you want to have an empty LiveRegion present in the page before you need anything announced. As close to page load as possible is best for better support. And once you have that empty element in the page, when you need announcements read, you push them into the LiveRegion element as updates. And that has much better support across platforms. Another fun trick, if you have a more app-like experience, and if you have things like toast notifications, for example, or a lot of different notifications, is to create a notification center. And what this does is this gives control back to the user. So as I mentioned before, toast notifications are easy to miss, and LiveRegions in general are very fragile. So one way to solve this is to create a notification center. And if anyone misses a notification, they can always go to the notification center and review it at their leisure. And they can use the notification center to check if there are any existing notifications that they may have missed. And this works very well in complex apps. If you have a website, I get it, you probably are not going to make a personal notification center. But in cases like this, it can work very well. So I've gone over a lot of the ways LiveRegions can go wrong, but not what you do once they've gone wrong. So one way to debug LiveRegions is with a Mutation Observer. Don't pay too much attention to the specific code on the slide. I have a link to a GitHub gist where I have code to create a Mutation Observer. But what this does is you essentially, you can paste this code in the console, pass it a reference to an element, and what that essentially does is it says, pay attention to this element and tell me when anything changes with that element or with any of the children within it. And because LiveRegions fire based on DOM changes, if you have a LiveRegion that's firing when you think it shouldn't, or it's not firing when you think it should, you can use a mutation observer to see if the element is actually changing in the way you think it should be. This really helps for JavaScript frameworks like React or Angular, where you can have, where they handle updating the DOM for you. So you're not always aware of exactly when things are updating and exactly what's updating. You can sometimes, if you make a mistake with your change diffing, like your DOM diffing, you can end up with changes happening in the DOM that you didn't intend and LiveRegions firing when you don't want them to. So this helps a lot with debugging that. And finally, my last recommendation is maybe don't use a LiveRegin. Maybe like cats, not everyone should adopt a cat. Not everyone should use a LiveRegin. Sometimes they're not the best choice. Instead of LiveRegions, you can, sometimes solutions that work better and are more robust are moving focus. When it makes sense to actually move keyboard focus, that's generally a much better way to communicate something to a user. Or write better instructions. Like say you have a checkbox in a form that toggles visibility of like a set of form fields below it. Instead of using a LiveRegin to communicate that, maybe just write like better instructions on the checkbox. Then you don't need a LiveRegin, and it's much simpler, more robust, better for users. So really quickly, we're at about 40 minutes. I'm going to take a little bit of time to go through the future of notifications, because if you've gotten anything out of this talk, I hope it's that it's very easy for LiveRegions to go wrong. You need to be very careful and put in a lot of work when you decide to create a LiveRegin to make sure it's really working right and really working well. And unfortunately, because there is so much manual work involved and there's so many support gaps and things like that, it means things are going to go wrong. A lot of people don't put in the work for accessibility, or it's overwhelming, or it's just easy to get wrong because it's, you know, it's a field that a lot of people don't think is worth as much time. So we really need to make this better. We need to get better support. We need to make it easier to create good experiences at a platform level and not just put everything on developers. So one of the ways you can help do that is file support issues when you run across support issues with browsers and screen readers with LiveRegions you implement. Here's a couple sample issues, one against JAWS about ARIA relevant not working, one against NVDA about conflicts between LiveRegions and focus changes. So go upvote those issues when you run into them, go file new issues when you find support gaps with documented patterns, and hopefully we'll get there. Another way is to get involved in standards. I mentioned that there are roles like log and marquee and timer that don't work and are in danger of extinction. Here is an issue filed on the ARIA spec about removing those roles. If you agree, if you disagree, it's really good to just like get perspective of other developers in there. I have a link to this issue in my slides, but also there's a bunch of other issues on the ARIA spec about LiveRegions. And if you have a need for a LiveRegin that isn't being met, please file a new issue and say what it is you need. And that's how we'll get like the actual language better, because right now it's honestly not that great. And we need to make the platform better and the language better, because there's like UI on the web is just getting more complex and more like applications. And if we want to build something like this someday, something like this, a real-time graph of CPU usage, which I've actually like worked on the web with teams like for like monitoring servers. If we want to have this kind of rich experience on the web, we need to make the platform support stuff like LiveRegions, because the more rich and more interactive the experience is, the more likely it is you're going to need a LiveRegin, and we really need these to work. So yes, please go out, push for browsers and screen readers and specs to handle the common use cases for you, to support new use cases that aren't supported now. There's forums like the Web We Want and like the issue trackers I mentioned. And finally, use your powers wisely. Now that you have all this information about LiveRegions, they can really make things better, and they can also sometimes make things way, way worse for people who use screen readers who are already marginalized and already often have a worse UI experience. So yes, let's make things better and not worse. And thanks for coming and listening. I have a bunch of links on the slides. The slides are up on GitHub, and I think there will be a link in the video at some point. Oh, and all the LiveRegin examples in the slides are actually LiveRegion. So if you want to try them with a screen reader, feel free. Yes, and that's
This
it.
has been awesome. Thank you. You have no idea how many chats we've read saying this is exactly why they come to ALI Talks. This is great information. So first and foremost, thank you so much. We have several questions. I'm not sure we're going to get through all of them, but go ahead. Just to anyone listening right now, make sure you keep the conversation going on Twitter, hashtag ALI Talks, and we'll keep the conversation going if we don't get it all through in the next few minutes. But enough of my chatter. For notifications, LiveRegions that have interactive elements within it, such as links or boxes, does keyboard navigation have to force focus on that element, or at least be the next tab in order? The next in tab order.
That's an interesting question. I would treat the keyboard behavior as separate from the live region behavior almost, because the live region is a dynamic announcement and semantic information about the button or link isn't going to be announced. It's just going to be announced as text. So if you need somebody to be able to access it immediately afterwards, that's a separate content design issue. Like if you have something dynamically popping up that someone needs to be able to interact with, it depends on what's appearing. Like the checkbox example that shows more form fields that I mentioned, like you click a checkbox or you turn a checkbox on and more form fields appear below it. Those should definitely be immediately after in the DOM order. But that's kind of a separate issue as from whether or not you also need it announced as a live region. So yeah, if you have things appearing, interactive things appearing that people need to be able to get to, then yes, as a keyboard user, you need to make sure they're immediately after in the DOM order, or you need to have some sort of keyboard shortcut that's known and surfaced and documented for them to get to that. But it's going to depend a lot on specifically what UI you're creating.
Real quick side note, the link that you mentioned earlier has been posted in the chat so people can get there. All right, so does the placement of where the live region sits in the DOM matter?
No, actually, no. Yeah.
Okay.
Whether the live region exists in the DOM before you update it does matter, but where in the DOM doesn't matter.
Cool. All right, is there a better, is it better to use the alert status rules or ARIA live assertive polite rules?
It depends on what you want to make. So the alert role has semantics, and multiple screen readers will read the word alert before the text of the alert when you use it. So it has that extra semantics, it has a bit of extra behavior. But in terms of whether or not, like how interrupting it is, it's the same as ARIA live assertive. So it depends if you want those semantics or if you just want the behavior. Like if it's something is semantically an alert, maybe use role alert. If it's not and you just need words announced, then use ARIA live. Same for status. You're muted, Donna.
Yeah, that was really smooth of me. Is there a recommended character limit to help decide whether or not to make an interactive text slider, for example, a live region?
Not really. It depends. Like again, like with a lot of live regions, it's very context dependent, and it's very like it really depends on your UI and what you're trying to communicate and how the user's interacting with it. There is no hard character limit. Me constantly saying it needs to be concise is just talking to people like coworkers at Microsoft who use screen readers and who have expressed that preference. But really, if you feel like something's too long, then talk to somebody who actually uses a screen reader about it, because it is so easy to get this wrong if you're sighted and if you don't use a screen reader, because it's very probably not what you think. Like the experience is probably not what you think, and what people need from a live region is probably not what you think if you don't rely on a screen reader.
Awesome. We're going to try to get through just a couple more of the questions, and then, as I said, any conversation we can move to Twitter. So regarding toast, curious what the recommended length, as there isn't a universal standard, but varying best practices.
Sorry, you broke up just a little bit. Something about toast?
Let's try this. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Sorry about that, and thank you for pointing that out. Regarding toasts, curious what the recommended length of time a toast should be displayed, as there isn't a universal standard, but instead varying best practices.
Yes. So there is actually a WCAG requirement about timing. So if you have a toast pop up and there's no other way to get that information other than reading the toast when it's visible, then you can't make it go away on a timer because you don't know how long somebody's going to need to get to it. Like, as I mentioned, people who use magnifiers might take a lot longer to find it and to actually navigate to it and read it. There are a number of other reasons someone might just take longer to consume information. So any timeout, it is not a great idea unless you have another way to review it, like a notification center. If you have a notification center, then just pick something that seems reasonable and you can rely on the fact that people can review them, like can have control over reviewing them at their leisure that way, and not through the toast. But if you have any timeout, no matter how long, you have to have another way to review that text.
Awesome. What are the recommendations for announcing new content with ARIA Live versus moving focus to new content?
Oh, yes, that's an excellent question. So focus should only move if the user is expecting focus to move. So if you're in a situation where someone is expecting their context to change, like they've clicked a button that opens a modal, or they've clicked a link that navigates to a new page, even if that's handled with JavaScript, or a button that opens a dropdown even. Like if you do something where the user can reasonably expect focus to change, and it has to be an immediate response to a user action, then you can move focus. Depending a little on the component, like modal, yes, you move focus. Dropdown, maybe, maybe not, depends on the dropdown. The requirement is essentially it must be in response to immediate user action. You can't have something happen asynchronously, like you can't have a toast pop up and take focus. The user has to be in control of their focus always. If that's the case, then yeah, rely on focus. If that's not the case, if something happens asynchronously or after a delay, or it's a toast and the user didn't call it up, then definitely don't use focus. It's kind of like expectation. Yeah. Donna, you're still muted.
Awesome. No, am I still muted? I don't
No, now you're good.
Okay. David asked, what happens if a live region changes content in the middle of being read out by a screen reader?
Yes, that is also an excellent question. So I actually have a code pen where I've tested a bunch of different ways live regions can fail. There's some straight up tests of roles and attributes, but I also have a section where I test conflicts. And that's similar, to a live region receiving 2 updates in quick succession, or one update that changes. It's effectively 2 updates in quick succession. And conflicts with live regions, whether it's 2 live regions conflicting or a single live region getting multiple updates or a live region conflicting with user interaction, all of those work differently across different screen readers and browsers. It's one of the places where support just isn't there, and it's one of the most frustrating things about live regions. There isn't one answer. There's like 10 answers for different screen reader and browser combinations. It's going to vary. Sometimes both updates will be announced in succession. Sometimes only the second will be announced and interrupt the first. It depends.
Awesome. All right, we have 3 questions. We're going to try to get through the last 3 that I see right now. One of our viewers remembers being told that you should only have 1 ARIA Live region on the page, though support for multiple per page seems okay. What are your recommendations?
So too many live regions on a page, like say you have 20, can really slow down performance if you're running a screen reader. And it increases the risk of live regions conflicting with each other, which can, cause issues. Other than that, there isn't a reason to only have 1 live region on the page. But if you have an app with a lot of notifications, having 1 live region and a notification service that manages updates to that live region can be a really good way to manage issues with conflicts and performance with multiple live region updates. So it's a best practice, but there isn't like a hard and fast rule, or like nothing's going to break if you have 3 or 4 LiveRegions on a page.
Awesome. All right. So what happens if a live, oh, wait, sorry, I just read that one. So finally, I guess Perry asked, what is preventing support inserting a new live region as opposed to updating an existing one?
So that's a good question. I'm not a screen reader developer or a browser developer, but as I understand it, so when you create a live region, you're essentially like flagging this area for screen readers to pay attention to, and also for browsers to pay attention to fire live region changed events when it changes. And there need like when you insert one dynamically into a part of the page that the screen reader isn't actively like focusing on, like if the screen reader is thinking I'm interacting with this part of the page over here and you change something over here, it's not necessarily paying attention to that. So because other page changes happen that aren't live regions, so performance wise it doesn't make sense to monitor every single page change. So if you have a live region present in the DOM before it changes, you're increasing the probability that the screen reader knows I need to pay attention to changes in this area here. I'm not sure entirely if that's a screen reader thing or a browser thing or both, but that's why.
All right, and then we do have one more question that snuck in. We have 2 minutes. Let's see if we can do it. James is asking, what about designing updates on collaborative documents, like notifying someone that someone else is editing the same paragraph or element?
Yes, there's actually an ARIA annotation spec that's being actively worked on for stuff like that. That would probably be better to pay attention to than just live regions, because if you're building something like Word Online or Google Docs, that is a lot more complex than really any of the use cases I talked about. There are probably some cases where you'd want live regions when something big happens, like maybe you're editing the same area or something and you really need the user to know that. You'd have to make a usability decision about whether you need to announce updates about like people opening the same document, whether that's important enough, and you should probably run user studies and check out the ARIA annotation spec, draft spec.
Awesome. Sarah, I cannot thank you enough. If you go back and look later at the chat, everyone listening has been thanking you right along as well. Thank you all for joining us for this month's A11yTalks. We are psyched that you are here. Sarah, we are psyched that you were able to join us. Keep the conversation going on Twitter, and don't forget to come on next month. We'll put the announcement out soon. And have a great day, everybody. Be safe, be healthy, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks for coming and listening.